"You can't sit here. This area is for people who actually qualify." The supervisor's voice was calm, almost polite. The little girl looked up, confused. Did I do something wrong? The train went silent. And in that moment, a simple seat turned into a question no one wanted to answer. Who gets to decide where you belong? But before we talk about rules, before we talk about authority, or who was right or wrong, we need to understand who Maya really was. Because she wasn't just a child on a train. She was a child who had been taught something most adults never fully learn. Maya Brooks was 9 years old, small for her age, quiet in the way kids are quiet when they spend a lot of time observing instead of demanding attention. She didn't walk into rooms expecting to be seen. She walked in ready to notice everything. That morning, she wore her favorite jacket, the one that was a little too big in the sleeves because she liked how it felt like a shield, and on her back was the backpack she never went anywhere without. It wasn't a store-bought backpack. It didn't have cartoon characters or shiny logos. It was handmade. Her dad, Ethan, had stitched it himself from leftover fabric in his workshop. Different shades, different textures, sewn together carefully, like he was building something that mattered. Because to him, it did. Inside the backpack were the usual things: a notebook, a pencil case, a small snack she always forgot to eat. But attached to the side was something different, a tiny solar panel, and inside, a battery pack no bigger than a phone. Ethan was an engineer. He worked long hours on city transit systems, the kind of infrastructure people only notice when it stops working. He believed in systems, in rules, in structure, but more than that, he believed in protecting the people who had the least power inside those systems. That backpack wasn't just a backpack. It was his quiet promise to her. "You don't need to be afraid," he had told her once while tightening one of the straps. "And you don't need to be invisible to be safe." Around her wrist, Maya wore another of his inventions, a simple band, soft on the skin, barely noticeable. But it held a GPS signal that connected directly to his phone. Not because he didn't trust her, but because the world wasn't always gentle with children who traveled alone. And she did travel alone sometimes. Not because she was forced to, but because Ethan had raised her to be capable. Not fearless, capable. He never taught her to argue with adults. He never taught her to be defiant. He taught her something much harder. He taught her how to stay calm when someone tried to make her feel small. Being polite doesn't mean being silent, he had told her. Following rules doesn't mean accepting injustice. And listening to authority doesn't mean surrendering your dignity. Those were heavy words for a 9-year-old, but Maya had grown up hearing them like lullabies. So when she stepped onto that train, she wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't trying to challenge anyone. She was just a child going where she was supposed to go, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had been told, again and again, that she had value even when no one else was watching. And that's the part that hurts the most when you think about what happened next. Because when a child like Maya is questioned, it doesn't just challenge her seat. It challenges everything she has been taught about the world being fair. Now let me ask you something. If that were your child, sitting there with that backpack, with that little wristband, trusting the world to be reasonable, what would you want them to know? Most of us teach our children to be polite, to listen, to not cause problems, to stay out of trouble. But how often do we teach them what to do when trouble comes looking for them? How often do we teach them the difference between respect and submission? Because those two things look very similar from the outside, but they feel very different on the inside. Maya wasn't taught to raise her voice. She wasn't taught to argue. She wasn't taught to threaten. She was taught to ask one simple question when something felt wrong. Did I do something wrong? That question doesn't attack. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't escalate. But it draws a line. It says, I am open to correction, but I am not accepting humiliation. And that's a skill many adults don't have. Some of us learned too early that silence felt safer, that compliance kept us protected, that blending in was survival. So we taught ourselves to shrink. But Maya hadn't learned that yet, because no one had taught her to disappear. And that's what makes this moment so powerful. This wasn't about a backpack, or a wristband, or even a seat on a train. It was about a child standing at the edge of a lesson most people spend their entire lives unlearning. The lesson that says, be small, and you'll be safe. Ethan had taught her a different one. Be respectful. Be calm. But never agree that you are less. And if you're a parent watching this, or if you ever were a child who wished someone had stood between you and injustice, you know how rare that kind of teaching is. We prepare our children for math tests, for fire drills, for stranger danger. But how often do we prepare them for quiet humiliation? For moments when someone uses authority not to guide, but to control, not to protect, but to exclude. Because that's what this was always going to become. Not a fight, not a confrontation, a test of whether a child would believe what she had been taught, or believe what power was about to tell her. And right now, sitting there with that handmade backpack and that little band around her wrist, Maya didn't know she was walking into one of the most important lessons of her life. She just knew she hadn't done anything wrong. And sometimes, that's the bravest place a child can stand. And this is where things began to change, because moments like these never start with shouting. They start with something that sounds reasonable. A calm voice, a polite smile, a sentence that feels like a suggestion, not a command. Veronica Hale approached Maya the way people with quiet authority always do. Not fast, not aggressive. Measured, controlled. Certain that the space already belonged to her. "Sweetheart," she said softly. "This area is reserved for passengers who meet specific qualifications. Not, you're not allowed. Not, you don't belong. Just specific qualifications." It sounded professional, neutral, almost kind. Maya looked up, confused, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her backpack. She didn't move. She didn't argue. She simply listened. Veronica pointed toward the rest of the train. "There are plenty of seats available over there. You'll be much more comfortable." Comfortable. That word was doing a lot of work, because what it really meant was, you need to leave. Maya glanced around. The seat wasn't broken. She wasn't bothering anyone. She wasn't loud. She wasn't in the way. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She asked, quietly, "Did I sit somewhere I'm not supposed to?" Veronica's smile didn't fade, but her posture changed. A little straighter. A little firmer. "This section is designated for individuals with verified access," she replied. "It's part of our protocol." Protocol. That word carries weight. It sounds official. It sounds final. It makes people stop asking questions. Maya nodded slowly. Not because she understood, but because she was trying to. She looked down at her shoes, then at her backpack, like maybe the answer was written on her own body. "I can move if I did something wrong," she said. And that was the moment many people miss. She wasn't trying to claim the seat. She was trying to protect her integrity. Veronica noticed the hesitation, the softness, the uncertainty. And that's when quiet power begins to test its limits. "I just need you to cooperate." "Okay," Veronica said, her tone still gentle. "But this isn't a discussion. Not a discussion. That's how authority closes doors. Without raising its voice, around them, the train hummed with ordinary life. Phones scrolling, music leaking through headphones, people half aware of a moment that was about to matter. Maya felt the heat rising in her cheeks, not from anger, from confusion. She wasn't being accused, but she was being displaced. And there's a difference. Veronica shifted closer now, lowering her voice, making the moment private even though it wasn't. "If you stay here, I'll have to report it," she said. "And that creates unnecessary trouble for you." Trouble. The word hung in the air. Maya had heard that word before. In school, on playgrounds, in situations where staying quiet was easier than being right. Her grip tightened around the backpack strap again. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she whispered. And Veronica nodded, as if they were in agreement. "Then let's make this easy," she said. "Please move to another seat. Polite, controlled, final. This is how power works when it doesn't want to look cruel. It offers compliance as kindness." Maya stood halfway, then stopped. She looked at the seat, at Veronica, at the empty space around her. And suddenly, the train felt smaller. Not because it was crowded, but because something invisible had closed in. She wasn't being yelled at. She wasn't being threatened, but she was being erased. Slowly, quietly, and everyone around them felt it. A woman a few rows away glanced up, then back to her phone. A man shifted in his seat, but said nothing. A teenager watched for a moment, then looked away, because it didn't look dramatic enough to interrupt. It didn't sound cruel enough to challenge. And that's how small injustices survive. Veronica noticed the hesitation. Her patience thinned. "I need you to move now," she said. No longer smiling, not louder, just colder. Maya's eyes searched for something solid, something to hold on to. She remembered Ethan's voice. "Stay calm, stay polite, but don't agree you're less." So she straightened her shoulders just a little. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said, "but I still don't understand what I did wrong." There it was. The question. The line in the sand. Veronica exhaled slowly, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "This is not about what you did," she replied. "This is about where you're allowed to sit." Allowed. The word cut deeper than any insult, because it wasn't about behavior anymore. It was about permission. Who had it, and who didn't? Maya swallowed. "So I'm not allowed?" she asked. Silence. Just long enough to feel like an answer. Veronica glanced around, aware now that eyes were lifting. Not many, but enough. "This isn't the appropriate area for you," she said carefully. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." That was the escalation. Not force, not yelling, but pressure. The kind that makes a child feel responsible for an adult's discomfort. Maya sat back down slowly. Not in surrender, in uncertainty. And for the first time, her voice trembled. "I just wanted to sit where it was safe." That sentence landed harder than anything else. Because children don't talk about status. They talk about safety. Veronica's jaw tightened. "This area is monitored," she said. "And it's important we keep it available for those who truly qualify. Truly." Another word that divides. Maya looked around again, at the empty seats, at the people who had more power than her and less courage than they wished they had. And she did something small, but brave. She stayed seated, not defiantly, not dramatically, just still. And in that stillness, the balance shifted. Because quiet authority depends on movement, on obedience, on people doing what they're told before they realize they're being judged. Maya wasn't resisting. She was asking to be seen. Veronica straightened fully now. "This is your final warning," she said. "If you refuse to comply, I will have to escalate this. Escalate." The word sounded heavy, dangerous, adult. Maya's heart raced, but she didn't cry. She looked up and asked, almost pleading, "Can you explain what makes me not qualify?" That was the moment the air changed, because power hates being questioned, especially by someone it considers small. And before we see what happens when that question is pushed too far, we need to understand something about the kind of authority Veronica was using. Because this wasn't about a seat. This was about a system that had taught her how to sound right while being wrong. But to understand what was really happening in that moment, we have to step back for just a second. Because this wasn't just about Maya, and it wasn't just about Veronica. This was about something much bigger. Something most of us have seen. Something many of us have even participated in, without realizing it. There is a dangerous idea in society that says, if something is written in a rule book, then it must be right. If something is labeled policy, then it must be fair. If something is called procedure, then it must be unquestionable. And that's how harm learns to wear clean clothes. Most people who cause deep emotional damage don't wake up thinking, "How can I be cruel today?" They wake up thinking, "I'm just doing my job. I'm just following protocol. I'm just maintaining standards." That's the language that turns human pain into paperwork. Veronica wasn't yelling. She wasn't insulting Maya. She wasn't even being openly aggressive. She was being correct. And that's what made it so dangerous. Because correctness, when it loses compassion, becomes a weapon. When Veronica said qualifications, she wasn't talking about safety. She wasn't talking about capacity. She wasn't talking about rules that protect people. She was talking about belonging. Who gets to be seen as legitimate? Who gets to occupy space without explanation? Who gets to exist without being questioned? And the scariest part, she probably believed she was right. This is what psychologists call moral distancing, when people separate their actions from their responsibility by hiding behind systems. It's not, "I removed a child from her seat." It becomes, "The protocol required me to act." It's not, "I made someone feel small." It becomes, "I upheld the standard." That distance protects the person in power from guilt, but it leaves the person being harmed completely alone with the impact. And this isn't rare. You see it in schools, in workplaces, in hospitals, in courtrooms, in airports, in government offices. Anywhere rules exist, there is the risk that someone will use them not to protect, but to control. Have you ever been told, "It's just policy," even when your heart knew something wasn't fair? Have you ever felt that moment when logic was used to shut down your humanity? That's what was happening to Maya. She wasn't being attacked. She was being processed, reduced to a category, evaluated against an invisible checklist, and found not sufficient. And the worst part, there was no way for her to win, because you can't argue with a system that refuses to explain itself. You can't defend yourself against a rule that won't define its own boundaries. You can't prove your worth to someone who has already decided you don't qualify. That's why Veronica's tone mattered more than her words. She sounded reasonable, professional, almost kind. But kindness that denies dignity is just control with a softer voice. Maya didn't feel attacked. She felt erased. And that kind of harm is harder to explain, harder to prove, harder to confront. That's why so many people stay silent in moments like this. Because how do you argue with procedure? How do you challenge standards? How do you fight something that hides behind legitimacy? This is why injustice often looks calm. It doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten, It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly removes people from spaces and calls it order. And when you're the one being removed, you start to question yourself before you question the system. Maya wasn't thinking. She's wrong. She was thinking. What did I miss? That's how power reshapes reality. It makes the victim doubt their own right to exist in the moment. And here's the truth that makes this even harder. People like Veronica rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as guardians, as protectors of quality, as defenders of order. But order without empathy becomes oppression. Standards without humanity become exclusion. Rules without accountability become cruelty. This is why the most dangerous kind of harm doesn't come from rage. It comes from certainty. The certainty that you are right, that the system supports you, that your authority doesn't need explanation. That's the moment power stops listening. And Maya, sitting there, small and unsure, was standing in the shadow of that certainty. She wasn't facing a person anymore. She was facing a system, and systems don't feel. They don't pause. They don't reflect. They execute. That's why moments like this matter so much. Because when a rule hurts someone who hasn't done anything wrong, the rule isn't neutral anymore. It becomes a choice. A choice to protect structure over people. A choice to protect image over fairness. A choice to protect authority over truth. And once that choice is made, silence becomes permission. The people around them could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. The tension wasn't just about a child and a seat. It was about whether anyone would challenge the idea that procedure mattered more than a person. Because if no one did, then Veronica wouldn't just move Maya. She would be confirmed. Confirmed that power doesn't need explanation. That authority doesn't need accountability. That children don't deserve justification. And that's how systems get stronger. Not because they are right, but because no one interrupts them. Maya was still sitting there, still calm, still confused. But the moment had already shifted from personal to political, from individual to institutional. This wasn't about whether she belonged in that seat. It was about whether rules existed to serve people, or people existed to submit to rules. And before we see how far Veronica would go to defend her version of order, we need to understand something even more unsettling. When rules become shields, they don't just protect authority, they teach cruelty how to look respectable. Before Veronica said anything that would change the entire story, there was one last moment where she still believed she was in control. She stood there, straight-backed, composed, certain that the rules were on her side, certain that her uniform gave her authority, certain that this was just another situation she could manage with the right words, and those words came easily. "This is standard procedure," she said. "We apply the same guidelines to everyone. Everyone. That word sounds fair. It sounds equal. It sounds just. But fairness is not about using the same words on different people. Fairness is about understanding how those words land. Because sometimes everyone is just a way to avoid saying who is really being targeted." Veronica took a small step closer to Maya. Not aggressively, not threateningly, but close enough to remind her who held the power. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said. "I'm trying to help you." Help. That word was meant to soften everything, but it carried the opposite message. Because help that demands submission isn't help. It's control dressed as concern. Maya didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved slowly, taking in the faces around her. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some pretending not to notice. She was still trying to understand what was happening, and Veronica mistook that silence for weakness. "You need to understand how things work," she continued. "There are standards for a reason. Standards. Another clean word. Another shield. Standards can protect, but they can also exclude. They can create safety, or they can create distance. And the difference depends entirely on who is allowed to define them. Veronica believed she was protecting order, but what she was really protecting was her right to decide who fit. This is how prejudice survives in modern spaces. Not through insults, not through shouting, but through language that sounds responsible. "I don't make the rules," she said. "I just enforce them." That sentence has ended more conversations than any threat ever could. It tells the other person, your feelings don't matter. Your confusion doesn't matter. Your dignity doesn't matter. Because the system has already spoken. And in that moment, Maya wasn't facing Veronica. She was facing the idea that systems can't be questioned. Maya lifted her chin slightly. Her voice was small, but steady. "I'm not trying to break any rules," she said. "I just want to understand them." That was all she asked for. Understanding. But understanding is dangerous to authority that relies on silence. Veronica's jaw tightened. Her tone sharpened. Just a little. "These guidelines are not open for interpretation," she replied. "They exist to maintain order." Order. Another powerful word. Order sounds safe. Order sounds necessary. But order without compassion becomes exclusion. Order without accountability becomes cruelty. Veronica looked around now, noticing more eyes watching. Not confrontational, but alert. She felt it. That shift. The room was no longer passive. "This situation is inappropriate," she said, her voice firm. "You are disrupting the environment." Disrupting. A child sitting quietly, asking a question. That was the disruption, and that was the moment where the mask began to slip. Because when authority stops making sense, it stops pretending to explain. It starts to classify. Veronica sighed, her patience thinning. "Look," she said, lowering her voice. "This section is meant for people who actually belong here." There it was. Belong. The word that changes everything. Not who are authorized, not who are registered, but who belong. That wasn't policy. That was belief. Maya blinked. "What does that mean?" she asked softly. Veronica hesitated. And hesitation is dangerous when you're trying to sound just... She looked at Maya's backpack, at her worn sneakers, at her small frame. Then she said it. "Well, people like you usually don't qualify." The air shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. People like you. That wasn't a rule. That wasn't a protocol. That was a category. And everyone heard it. You could feel it ripple through the space. The way discomfort spreads when truth finally surfaces. A woman in the back straightened in her seat. A man lowered his phone. Someone whispered, "Did she just say that?" Because now it was clear. This was never about safety. Never about structure. Never about fairness. It was about judgment. About who deserved comfort. Who deserved access. Who deserved respect. And who didn't. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. Not because she was scared, but because she finally understood. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was exclusion. "People like me," she repeated quietly. Veronica didn't answer. She had already said too much. That one sentence stripped away everything that had protected her before. The language of professionalism, the shield of protocol, the illusion of neutrality. What remained was something raw and undeniable. Bias. Not a rule, not a standard, not a system, a belief. And once belief is exposed, it can be challenged. Before that moment, People could look away and tell themselves it was complicated, that it was procedural, that there were details they didn't understand. But now it was simple. A child had been judged not by her actions, but by who someone decided she was. That's the moment injustice stops being abstract. That's the moment silence becomes a choice. Maya's voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It settled. "I didn't know seats could decide who I am," she said. The words were soft, but they landed hard, because they revealed the truth beneath everything. This was never about seating. It was about identity. Veronica looked around and saw it. The faces were no longer passive. They were watching her, waiting for explanation, for justification, for something that could make that sentence make sense. And she had none. That's the danger of prejudice hiding behind policy. It feels powerful until it's named, until it's seen, until a child is brave enough to reflect it back to you. People like you. Those words had drawn a line, and everyone on that train now knew exactly which side they were standing on. Not because Maya demanded it, not because anyone shouted, but because truth had finally spoken out loud. And once a system reveals its bias, it can no longer pretend to be neutral. The mask was gone. All that remained was choice. Would people defend the rule or defend the child? Because from this moment forward, no one could say they didn't understand what was really happening. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The train was still moving. The world outside was still normal. But inside that space, everything had changed. Because now, it wasn't unclear anymore. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't procedure. It was personal. Maya stayed where she was, not because she was stubborn, not because she was trying to win, but because she finally understood what was being asked of her. She wasn't being asked to move seats. She was being asked to agree that she didn't belong. And that was something she couldn't do. She took a slow breath, just like Ethan had taught her. "Stay calm. Stay polite. Know your worth. I'm sorry," she said softly. "But I don't think this is about rules anymore." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. But everyone heard it. Veronica's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked. Maya looked up at her, small but steady. "You said people like me don't qualify. That doesn't sound like a rule. That sounds like a judgment." The words hung in the air. A murmur spread through the cabin. Not loud, but real. A woman near the window whispered, "She's right." A man 2 rows back shifted in his seat and said, "That's not protocol." Veronica straightened. "You are misinterpreting what I said," she replied sharply. "This is about access, not identity." But it was too late. Once a truth is named, it can't be undone. Maya didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She just asked another question. "Can you show me where it says I'm not allowed to sit here?" Silence, not the awkward kind, the dangerous kind. Because authority depends on having an answer. Veronica opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "This is at my discretion." Discretion. That word changed everything. Because discretion isn't law. It isn't policy. It isn't protocol. It's personal power. And now everyone could see it. A man stood up slowly. "I've been writing this line for 6 years, he said. "There's no rule that says a child can't sit there." Another voice joined in. "She's not bothering anyone," a woman added. "And the area isn't even full." The witnesses were waking up. Veronica felt it. She raised her voice for the first time. "This situation is escalating," she said. "And I will not allow disruption." Disruption. The word she used when she lost control. Maya didn't flinch. "I just want to understand why I don't belong," she said quietly. Belong. That word again. And suddenly, it wasn't a child asking anymore. It was a system being questioned. Veronica reached for her radio. "If you don't move immediately," she warned, "I will call security." There it was, the threat, the final step in small power. But this time, it didn't land the same. Because now, the room was full of witnesses, and witnesses change everything. A young woman near the aisle spoke up. "Calling security on a child for asking a question doesn't look like safety," she said. "It looks like punishment." Another man added, "We all heard what you said about people like her." "That wasn't a rule." Veronica's face flushed. "You're misunderstanding my intent," she snapped. Intent. The last refuge of authority when impact is undeniable. Maya spoke again. "You don't have to mean to hurt someone for it to hurt," she said. A pause. A breath. A truth. And then something unexpected happened. From the end of the cabin, a voice cut through. Veronica Hale. It was calm, firm, adult. Supervisor Mark Reynolds stepped forward. Tall, gray at the temples, wearing the kind of uniform that didn't need to assert itself. Authority without performance. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. Veronica turned quickly. "This passenger is refusing to comply with seating protocol," she said. "I was about to contact security." Mark looked at Maya first, not at Veronica. "Is that true?" he asked gently. Maya swallowed. "I asked why I wasn't allowed to sit here," she said. "And she said people like me don't qualify." The cabin went quiet. Mark turned slowly to Veronica. "Did you say that?" Veronica hesitated. "I was explaining eligibility standards," she replied. Mark didn't raise his voice. "Did you use the phrase, people like you?" Another pause. Then, quietly, "Yes." That was all it took. Mark nodded once. "Step away from the passenger," he said. The tone was final. Veronica stiffened. "I was following discretion guidelines," she insisted. Mark pulled out his tablet. "No," he said. "You were exercising personal judgment, and that's different." He tapped a few times. "And it's not the first time." Veronica froze. "What do you mean?" Mark's voice stayed calm. "There's a record from 3 years ago," he said. "Another route. Similar complaint. Similar language. It was closed without resolution." The cabin erupted in whispers. "So this isn't new," someone said. "She's done this before," another asked. Veronica's confidence cracked. That case was dismissed, she argued. There was no proof. Mark looked up. "There is now." He gestured around. "You have witnesses. Multiple. And a consistent pattern." The room shifted. This wasn't about a misunderstanding anymore. This was about accountability. Maya stood slowly. Not to leave, but to be seen. "I didn't want to cause trouble," she said. "I just didn't want to agree that I was less." Her voice was steady. The kind of steady that only comes from truth. Mark looked at her and nodded. "You didn't cause this," he said. "You revealed it." He turned back to Veronica. "You are relieved of duty for the remainder of this shift," he said. "Security will escort you to file a formal report." Veronica opened her mouth, closed it, and for the first time, she had no words. Because power only works when it's unquestioned. And today, it had been questioned by a child, in front of everyone. As Veronica was led away, the cabin didn't cheer. It didn't clap. It breathed, like a space finally released from pressure. Maya sat back down. not victorious, not proud, just grounded. Mark knelt slightly to her level. "You're allowed to sit here," he said, "and you're allowed to ask questions. Always." Maya nodded. Around her, strangers who had once stayed silent now met her eyes. Not with pity, with respect. Because the truth was no longer hidden. It wasn't in the corner. It wasn't behind procedure. It wasn't masked by professionalism. It was out in the open. And once truth is witnessed, power loses its disguise. That was the moment everything changed. The room felt lighter after Veronica was taken away, like a storm had passed, like justice had finally breathed. And for a moment, it was tempting to feel satisfied, to feel relieved, to feel proud. Because the truth had won. Because the right person had spoken. Because the system had responded. But then a quieter, heavier question began to surface. What if it hadn't? What if Maya had been alone? What if she had no witnesses willing to speak? No supervisor willing to listen? No history record that exposed a pattern? What if she were just another child with no name, anyone recognized, no one connected, no one powerful, no one to vouch for her? Would justice still have arrived, or would the story have ended very differently? Imagine the same scene, same train, same seat, same voice telling her, "You don't belong here." But this time, no one shifts in their seat. No one clears their throat. No one says, "That's not protocol." The room stays quiet. The radio crackles. Security arrives. And a small child is escorted away for causing a disruption. No apology, no accountability. Just another line in a daily report that reads, "Situation resolved." Resolved for who? For the system. Or for the child who just learned that being quiet is safer than being right. This is the part of the story that hurts more than the confrontation itself. Because it asks something uncomfortable. Is justice automatic, or is it selective? Does it arrive because the truth is strong, or because someone strong is willing to carry it? We love stories where the good side wins, where the villain is exposed, where authority steps in and makes things right. They restore our faith. They make us feel like the world still works. But they also hide a harder truth. Sometimes, the world only works when people make it work. And sometimes, it doesn't. That's the question no one wants to ask. If Maya didn't have support, would she still be believed if she cried instead of speaking calmly? Would she still be respected if she had been louder, messier, angrier? Would her pain have been dismissed as behavior? Because here's what many people know deep down, even if we rarely say it out loud. Justice is not always about who is right. Sometimes it's about who is heard. And being heard often depends on power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to be taken seriously. That's why this story feels so powerful and so unsettling at the same time. We celebrate Maya's courage, but we also wonder how many children before her didn't get that ending. How many were told to move, to be quiet, to not cause trouble, to stop making a scene, and they did. Not because they were wrong, but because they were alone. This is why the question matters. If there was no backup, would the system still protect the vulnerable, or would it protect itself? Think about it. How many times in real life have you seen someone treated unfairly, but stayed silent because it wasn't your place? How many times have you felt something was wrong, but hoped someone else would speak first? How many times have you thought, if I get involved, this could get complicated? That hesitation is human, but it's also how injustice survives. Not because everyone is cruel, but because many people are unsure. And systems thrive on uncertainty. They thrive when no one wants to be the first to say, "This isn't right." Maya didn't have power. She had clarity. She didn't threaten. She asked. She didn't attack. She named. But clarity alone isn't always enough. Clarity needs witnesses. It needs echo. It needs courage from others. That's the hidden truth in this moment. Maya didn't win because she was brave. She won because bravery met response. Because someone chose to believe her. Because someone chose to listen. Because someone chose to stand beside her. Without that, courage becomes exhaustion, and truth becomes isolation. So when we ask, if there was no support, would justice come? We're really asking something deeper. Is our society built to protect people, or to protect order? Because order is comfortable, order is predictable, order keeps things quiet. But justice is disruptive. Justice asks questions. Justice makes people uncomfortable. And that's why it doesn't arrive on its own. It arrives when someone insists, when someone refuses to treat silence as peace, when someone understands that no trouble isn't the same as no harm. This story isn't just about Maya. It's about us, about the moments when we become witnesses, about the moments when we decide whether we're part of the background or part of the balance. Because here's the truth that stays with you long after the scene ends. War doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like standing still and being seen. But fairness doesn't live in standing alone. It lives in standing together. And the most dangerous lie we ever tell ourselves is this, that someone else will handle it. Because sometimes there is no someone else. Sometimes the only difference between injustice and accountability is a single voice saying, "I saw it. I heard it. This isn't right." That's why this part of the story matters more than the victory. It reminds us that justice is not guaranteed. It is built, moment by moment, choice by choice. And the real question isn't whether Maya was brave. The real question is, if you were there, would you have been quiet, or would you have been the reason she wasn't alone? Maya didn't win this moment by herself, and that's the part people often miss. We love stories about brave individuals. We love heroes. We love to believe that courage alone is enough. But in real life, courage without witnesses is fragile. Think about it. Maya spoke the truth. She stayed calm. She named what was wrong. But her words didn't become powerful until other people heard them. Until other people decided, yes, we see it too. Yes, this matters. Yes, this isn't just her problem. Truth changes the moment it stops being private. Because a truth whispered in a corner is easy to ignore. A truth spoken in front of witnesses becomes responsibility. That's how society actually works. Not through heroes, through visibility. In every system, power hides in quiet spaces, in places where no one is watching. Where one voice can be dismissed, where one person can be labeled difficult, emotional, or confused. That's why injustice loves isolation. If Maya had been alone, her truth could have been rewritten as misunderstanding, as overreaction, as a child being dramatic. But she wasn't alone. There were eyes. There were ears. There were people who could say, "I heard that. I saw that. That wasn't right." And suddenly, her experience stopped being an opinion. It became a fact. That's the power of witnesses. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. We often imagine justice as something that arrives from above, from a judge, from a supervisor, from an authority figure stepping in at the perfect moment. But authority doesn't move without pressure. And pressure doesn't exist without shared awareness. No witnesses means no urgency. No urgency means no action. That's not cruelty. That's structure. Systems respond to what is visible. They correct what is undeniable. They move when silence becomes noise. And witnesses turn silence into noise. That's why this moment wasn't just about Maya. It was about everyone who decided not to look away. The teacher who shifted in her seat, the nurse who frowned, the student who quietly recorded, the passenger who finally spoke. None of them were heroes. They were just people who chose not to disappear. And that choice is rare, because being a witness is uncomfortable. It means stepping into tension. It means risking being wrong. It means being seen. Most people aren't cruel. They're cautious. They think, maybe I misunderstood. They think, it's not my place. They think, someone else will handle it. And sometimes, that someone else never comes. That's why injustice survives so well in public spaces. Not because everyone supports it, but because everyone waits. Maya's story flips that pattern. It shows us that justice doesn't begin with authority. It begins with acknowledgement. With a simple decision, I won't pretend this didn't happen. That's how truth gains weight. Not through volume, through numbers. One voice can be doubted. 10 voices create reality. That's why history changes when crowds speak. When movements form. When stories are shared. Not because the truth suddenly becomes truer, but because it becomes impossible to ignore. This is the difference between pain and proof. Pain is personal. Proof is collective. And witnesses turn pain into proof. That's why Maya's victory wasn't just emotional. It was structural. It showed how fragile power becomes when it is observed. Veronica had authority in silence. She had control in isolation. She had confidence when no one challenged her. But the moment the space filled with witnesses, her power evaporated. Because authority without legitimacy collapses the second people stop pretending. This is why stories like this matter. They remind us that justice isn't a character. It's a process, a fragile one, a human one. It needs participation. It needs people who are willing to be slightly uncomfortable, so someone else doesn't have to be completely powerless. Being a witness doesn't mean fighting. It doesn't mean shouting. It doesn't mean becoming a hero. Sometimes it just means staying. Staying present. Staying honest. Staying open. It means saying, I saw what happened, even if your voice shakes, even if you're unsure, even if it would be easier to stay quiet, because silence protects the wrong thing, and witness protects the truth. That's why this story hits so deeply. Not because Maya was extraordinary, but because she wasn't. She was a child, in a public place, depending on strangers to decide what kind of world she was in. And those strangers chose. They chose not to disappear. That's what creates justice, not one powerful person stepping in, but many ordinary people stepping forward. That's the lesson hidden inside this moment. Truth doesn't gain value because it exists. It gains value because it is seen. And being seen is not automatic. It is a gift people give each other. So when we ask, why do witnesses matter? The answer is simple and unsettling, because without them, truth has no protection. Without them, right and wrong become negotiable. Without them, harm becomes routine. And with them, even a small voice can reshape a system. That's the real power in this story. Not courage alone, not authority alone, but courage that finds witnesses. By the end of this story, it would be easy to focus on consequences, on reports filed, on disciplinary action, on policies reviewed. But if that's where we stop, we miss the real ending. Because this story was never about power. It was about belonging. Not the kind you're granted by a badge or a title, but the kind you claim by standing upright and refusing to shrink. Maya didn't earn her place that day. She didn't prove herself worthy of respect. She didn't pass a test. She reminded everyone that dignity isn't a reward. It's a starting point. And that truth is uncomfortable, because it means no one gets to decide who deserves to be treated as human. Not a supervisor, not a rule book, not a uniform, not even a majority. You belong before permission is given. That's what makes this moment powerful. Maya didn't say, "Please let me stay," she said. Without words, "I am already here." And that distinction changes everything. How many times in our lives have we acted as if we needed approval to exist fully, to speak, to take space, to be respected? How many times have we waited for someone else to confirm our worth? This story gently but firmly tells us, stop waiting. You don't belong because you're perfect. You belong because you're human. And when someone challenges that, the question isn't whether you qualify. The question is why they believe they get to judge. That's the quiet revolution inside this story. Not rebellion, not anger, just presence, standing without apology, speaking without permission, existing without shrinking. And that doesn't only apply to children, it applies to all of us. Every time you walk into a room and wonder if you're enough, every time you lower your voice to avoid being labeled difficult, every time you accept disrespect to keep the peace, you're reenacting the same question Maya was forced to answer. Do I belong here? And the answer is always yes. Not because you're impressive, not because you're powerful, not because someone important says so, but because you showed up. That's why this ending doesn't belong to Maya alone. It belongs to every person who has ever been told, subtly or directly, that they don't fit, that they're too much, too little, too different, too inconvenient. Belonging is not conformity. It's courage. It's the courage to stand where you are without shrinking. But this story also leaves us with responsibility. Because dignity doesn't protect itself. It relies on witnesses. When you see someone being quietly pushed out, when you hear language that hides harm behind politeness, when you sense that something isn't fair, but everyone is staying silent, that's your moment. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. You become part of the truth when you refuse to look away. And that's how change happens. Not through grand gestures, but through small acts of recognition. I saw that. That wasn't right. You're not alone. Those words rebuild dignity. This is why the most powerful ending to this story isn't a punishment. It's a reminder. You belong wherever you dare to stand fully as yourself, not because the space welcomes you, but because you don't abandon yourself to fit it. That's what Maya showed us. A child didn't ask for space. She occupied it. And in doing so, she reminded a whole system of something it had forgotten. Human worth is not negotiable. So if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever swallowed words to stay safe, if you've ever wondered whether you were allowed to take up space, let this be the answer. You don't wait to belong. You decide. And when you see someone else being pushed aside, you don't wait for authority. You become witness. Because belonging grows when we protect it in each other. That's how justice becomes real. That's how dignity survives. That's how systems change. Not through fear, through courage. Not through permission, through presence. So wherever you are today, in whatever room you step into, remember this. You don't belong because you were invited. You belong because you exist. And when someone else is questioned, stand beside them. Be the witness.